Forgiveness is at the heart of every relationship. Forgiveness is at the heart of the message of Jesus, but it's also the heart of every relationship. It's the heart, I'd say, the whole of the history of the world. Forgiveness or refusal to forgive. It's eye for eye, tooth for tooth. You've hurt me, so I'll hurt you. Jesus came as the Lamb who took away the sin of the world. And sin is this barrier around our hearts. And this barrier prevents us being in relationship to God, in relationship to other people, but also in relationship to what is deepest in myself. And this barrier protects us. And if we've been hurt, we want to hurt. Today we're going to talk about the forgiveness of Jesus. We're going to talk about guilt and how in some way to be relieved of guilt. I think in all of us there's guilt. We're frightened. We're frightened of people seeing us as no good, frightened of seeing us as bad. And if they see us as bad, maybe then we'll be rejected and we'll be all alone. So there's a tendency in us always to pretend that we're good, that we're intelligent, that we are called for esteem of people. I'd like to just tell you the story of John, who's in my own community, and he suffered a great deal as a child. He wasn't wanted by his parents, and very quickly he was put with his grandparents. The grandparents didn't want him because he appeared as a nuisance and he used to cry and run around. And so he's put with a family placement. The first family placement couldn't keep him. He went to another family placement, and finally a third family placement, and eventually he ended up in the psychiatric hospital. He was always seen as a nuisance. Nobody ever wanted him. So grew up within him the sentiment of, I'm no good. Nobody can love me. And creates inside of him that broken self-image. This is what we call psychological hate, psychological guilt, or some people call it shame. Because in point of fact, it touches the very foundation of that man. A sense that he is no good, and that he can do no good, and that he is of no value. This psychological guilt is imposed upon us from outside. Moral guilt is when we think we're okay, but we've done something wrong. And we know we've done something wrong, and that we've done an act which we shouldn't have done, we've hurt someone, and so on. So we have these two forms of guilt, which in point of fact are intertwined. Because with the psychological guilt of, I am no good, well then, because I'm no good, I'll do things that are no good. And so the whole question is how to relieve people from guilt. All of us, we're carrying a lot of this guilt because we don't know how to love. Husbands don't know how to love their wives. Wives don't know how to love their husbands. Children don't know how to love their parents. Parents their children. We're all hurting each other. And then we come to this situation as just this sentiment that I am no good, that I can't do anything of any value. So let's come to this gospel story today and see what happens. Jesus is teaching in the temple, and suddenly a commotion. Some men come rushing in with a woman who is half naked. They're pulling her in and throws her in front of Jesus. And they say, this woman was caught in the very act of adultery. Moses says that women like that should be stoned. What do you say? You see, they're trying to test Jesus. See, up until now, Jesus has spoken a lot about forgiveness. He says he came not for the just, but for sinners. He came to forgive. He came to reveal the love for every person. And so if he says we must forgive this woman, then he's going against Moses. If on the other hand he says, well, here's a case she has to be stoned, well, in this case, he's contradicting himself. And so these men are trying to put Jesus in a situation where he's contradicting himself. And then he's obviously not the Messiah. He's not a prophet. He's contradicting himself. So they're really testing him, trying him. Jesus bends down, starts writing in the dust, in the soil. And then says, "What do you say?" And so he looks up. And he just says, "Let the one who is without sin, let him throw the first stone." And he bends down again and starts writing. And the story says that they start leaving, one after another, beginning with the eldest, because it was always the eldest who threw the first stone. In this gospel event, we see three trials are taking place. There's essentially the trial of Jesus, because these men want to trap Jesus. There's the trial of the woman who has committed adultery. And then there's the trial of these men, these rather vicious men. And behind each one of these trials, there's fear. First of all, there's the fear of these men who want to try Jesus. What are they frightened of? Jesus appears as a prophetic figure announcing a message of love. In some way, he's threatening some people. His proximity to those that are called sinners, who are frequently condemned and pushed aside. His proximity to the poor and to the weak. The way he spoke of his relationship with his Father, all this is rather frightening for some of the religious authorities. And they're frightened also because maybe Jesus will create a revolution. If he's the Messiah, and maybe some people are talking about him as the Messiah, and if people start coming to him and going after him and so on, and if he leads a revolution, well, then maybe the Roman armies will come and create direct rule instead of indirect rule from Rome to Jerusalem. So you see in these men, they're trying to get rid of Jesus. He's becoming a nuisance. Like a lot of prophetic figures can be a nuisance, like Martin Luther King or Mahatma Gandhi or Nelson Mandela. They become a nuisance because in some way they're answering or announcing a truth of justice. So there's the trial of Jesus, and what these men want is they're using the woman, but in order to condemn Jesus. Then we have the trial of this woman. She's been caught in the act of adultery. Had it been planted or not, we don't know. Nothing is said, but she's obviously terribly scared. Does anyone know about it? What about her husband and her children and so on? So she's frightened, she's ashamed, and we're talking about stoning her to death. So she's petrified. She's in a state of absolute fear of death. And then we have the trial of these men. Because these men, there's something vicious inside of them. And they're not yet quite conscious of all that is vicious in them. And as I say, they're using this woman to condemn Jesus. But the very words of Jesus seems to bring them to look into themselves. Jesus says, "Whoever is without sin, let him throw the first stone." So somewhere inside of them, they are becoming conscious that there is sin within them. In the story, we see Jesus bending down. I find that very moving. These men are standing up, shouting, and he is bending even maybe lower than the woman. Somewhere, Jesus is the Word who descended into humanity, into flesh. And so he's down there in the bottom of humanity. He doesn't stand up and say, strong, no. And his words, let him who is without sin throw the first stone, are the words of great beauty. He's not judging anyone or anything. He's just revealing a truth. And revealing that truth, he's saying to these men, there is sinfulness inside of you. But he's not accusing. He's not judging. He just says that very gentle phrase, you see, in a way, truth is the greatest weapon, if I may use that expression, against insolent might. Truth. What I find very moving in this scene is the silence of Jesus. These men come and shout at him and want an answer. He doesn't answer, just bends down. You see, Jesus didn't come to judge people. He came to reveal to people that they are beautiful, that they have value. And the whole of the mystery of Jesus is that revelation that people have value. And then when they discover that they have value, because love responds to love. If we discover that we are loved by Jesus, then we'll want to respond to that love of Jesus. So Jesus, bending down, is saying, I don't want to answer. Because all I want in one way to be close to this woman, to save her. But I want to be close also to these men, to help them discover how beautiful they are, and that their fear is covering up their real human beauty and value. They've got caught up in a world of anger and fear. So the silence of Jesus, and then those incredible words, that the one of you who is without sin, let him throw the first stone. Jesus is just helping people to discover, yes, there is sin in us, but he's come to forgive. This story is telling us something about Jesus and about the love of Jesus for us. But it's also in some way revealing something in ourselves. You see, somewhere inside of us, because we feel guilty, and I've mentioned that we don't know how to love people, somewhere, maybe are we seeking to be punished? And then do we create a God who will punish? Because somewhere in our education, there is the powerful God telling us you mustn't do this, and if you do, bang. And we have a lot of difficulty with unconditional love. And so, because we feel guilty, there's something very deep in the human nature. When we feel guilty, we sometimes want to hurt ourselves. That's somewhere the basis of masochism, that we want to hurt ourselves because we feel guilty. So something is being told to us about this incredible love of Jesus for each one, who's come to take away all these blockages to help us to rise up. I'd like to tell you a story which I lived, and it's a very moving story, to show how difficult it is about judging, how to judge people, and then not to judge. I was quite some years ago in Kingston Maximum Security Prison, and I was speaking in the gymnasium to quite a number of hundreds of men. And when I speak to men who are inmates in prisons, I always feel a certain poverty and how to reach them. And because somewhere I understand the depth of their pain, their anger, and all sorts of things. So normally what I do is talk about people like John, feelings of guilt, and how they're yearning to be loved, and their need to find people who appreciate them. And so I gave a whole talk, and I remember speaking particularly about a young man called Eric, who was blind and deaf, an incredibly beautiful person. When I finished talking, a man got up and screamed at me. I mean, he was a very powerful, strong man. And he said, "You've had it easy. You know nothing about our life." And if another man comes into this prison and talks about love, I'll kick his bloody head in. And there was a sort of silence. And I felt I had my back to the wall. And I just asked Jesus to give me the right answer, because I wanted to. So I was at peace. And I said to the man, you know, I really understand what you're saying. You see, it's true. I don't know what you're living. I don't know all that you've. But would you permit me, just when I give talks outside of this prison, just to say what you have said then? Because it's important that people understand. And he said, yeah. And then I said to him, well, look, if I come back in this region, can I come back and share with you again? Because if people need to hear about you, sometimes it can be useful for you to hear about people are living outside. So would you permit me to come back? And he said, yeah. There were a few more questions. And when all was over, I went right up to him and I took his hand. And I said, tell me, what is your name and where do you come from? And then I had some sort of inspiration. I said, tell me, are you married? He said, yeah. So I said to him, will you tell me about your wife? Suddenly this man started weeping. Tears came down his cheeks. And he told me that his wife was in a wheelchair and that he hadn't seen her for 2 years. Suddenly I saw what this man wanted. He was craving for tenderness. And here I, a stranger, I come in and talk about tenderness, and he can't bear it, because it's awakening very deep things. And so he yelled at me, because he just couldn't stand the inner pain, his own cry for tenderness. So we must never judge anyone, because sometimes violence comes because people haven't been loved. Let's come back now to the story. The men have left. Jesus has returned to that downward position and is writing in the sand. And then he looks up and says, woman, where are they? And then he says, has anyone condemned you? She says, no. And Jesus just says, I don't condemn you either. Go and sin no more. Incredible tenderness in this meeting. Woman, where are they? You just sense that all the guilt and the fear of this woman has suddenly gone away. She's saved. She's liberated. And as you know, the word forgive in Greek means to liberate. So this woman, suddenly there's a liberation. In a way, she can stand up. But she's changed. She's deeply changed. Because she's seen those eyes of Jesus. Jesus, who is the prophet, maybe even the Messiah. And he's looked at her with love and said, I don't condemn you. I don't. And then he says, go and do not sin. And you see, sin is the refusal, a conscious refusal to accept the love of Jesus, the love of God. It's I don't want to be healed. And so Jesus is liberating her. Can each one of us believe those words when Jesus says, I don't condemn you? Because there is the heart of the mystery. But somewhere there's something strange in we human beings. We cling on to guilt because we can cling on to vengeance and we can cling on to depression. And so those words of Jesus are incredibly healing words. Because those words, I don't condemn you, are words which are calling us to rise up from guilt, to become men and women who are fully alive, so that then, because we have been forgiven, we can start to forgive others. But we have to be careful, because forgiveness is not an event. Forgiveness is a long process, because everything with human beings is about growth. The mystery of living is to grow, and growth is the gradual capacity to forgive. Our danger is to judge before seeing the beauty, whereas the whole message of Jesus is that gradually we are called to become men and women of peace through the power of the Spirit, so as we can see your beauty in your culture, in your religion, in your non-religion, in your humanity, in all that you are, as a person with disabilities, mental disabilities, people who have Alzheimer, people who are in AIDS, old people, to see in every one the value that is there. And to see the value is not just to do good to them, but it's to reveal to them that they can do good to us.